Hello everyone, my name is Patrick and this is Giselle. Today we'll be talking to you about Denver's Sustainability Roadmap for 2050. So, just to give you an outline of the presentation, we'll go into the current context of what Denver's like today, we'll go over the various project parts, and then we'll bring it back to our projections for greenhouse gases and the urban metabolism diagram in 2050. So, just to give you a background of the current situation in Denver, population as of 2016 was about 3.15 million people. Total emissions were about 63 megatons of CO2, and on a per capita basis, this works out to about 20 tons of CO2. So 65% of the emissions from Denver, as you can see here on the orange and blue, come from commercial and residential buildings, with about 1/3 of this being made up due to the use of natural gas for heating, which makes sense given that there's about 5,500 heating degree days, and on the flip side, there's about 900 cooling degree days, both of which are greater than the values for Toronto. Also, the current electricity mix for Denver is fairly dirty, which results in the 232 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. So here's our urban metabolism diagram for 2016, and it's tough to see what's down here. Sorry. The majority of the emissions for Denver on a per capita basis are made up due to transportation.
So the first thing I'm going to talk about in order to tackle the emissions for Denver is the building sector. Now, there are provisions in the building codes to try to render buildings more efficient and less polluting. The map you see on the left side is a heat map of efficient buildings in Denver. But what they mean by efficient is actually not the greatest. It just means that it's a little bit more efficient than the normal standard design. So Denver is a typical North American city made up of a central business district with a bunch of office buildings, but most of its land area is made up of low-density, single-unit family households. So what we want to aim for 2050 is to have all buildings in Denver be net zero energy and emissions. And just to illustrate the feasibility of this goal, Vancouver is planning on doing the same by 2030 for all their new and existing buildings. So there's several actions that Denver can take in order to reach that. We could implement a massive envelope retrofit program to reduce the energy demand overall and increase the passive solar feature of buildings. The City of Denver should put together a sustainability team of city officials from various departments that would go and help residents and single businesses one by one to develop solutions that fit their situations to minimize the economic impact on individuals and businesses. And the city should encourage LEED certified buildings by fast-tracking their approvals through their approval process. A really simple policy tool, but also equally powerful, is to implement an economy-wide carbon tax just to discourage the use of emitting fuels overall. So how could this look like? On the left is a picture of a residential household with solar panels and its negative energy use. So they take in more energy than they need and they sell it back to the grid. Over here on the top right is a new commercial building in Edmonton that doesn't use natural gas at all for heating. It ends up being cheaper because of a very efficient design that requires very little energy. So what we want to aim for is to completely eliminate any fossil fuel use for building operations in general. Green roofs are very useful in terms of absorbing any emissions from the air in the city, improving air quality as well as reducing emissions.
So now we talk about the transportation side of our design. Just to give you an idea of what is in Denver right now. Like Giselle said, Denver is a typical North American city. The streets are predominantly laid out in a grid pattern. They have high occupancy toll lanes along Interstate 25. A lot of the rail lines are laid out in a radial format. There's about 1,800 miles of bike lanes and off-street trails, and Denver actually has one of the highest rates of cycling usage in America. And also the city can be accessed by several freeways. So in the map here you can see the configuration of the existing transit routes in Denver. The black is commuter rail, the red is LRT, and by and large they essentially exist to serve the central business district. So some of the current issues on the transportation side in Denver are that there's a heavy reliance on automobiles for trips. Roughly 85% of trips currently are made by the automobile. There's inadequate protection for cyclists despite the fact that there's a high usage rate. You basically have share roads with the majority of the cycling network, which is basically just a striped marker on pavement showing cars that they need to share the road with bikes. There's about a 250-mile gap in the pedestrian facilities, meaning there's about there are areas without sidewalks, and transit ridership has declined by 5 million riders over the last 3 years. So as part of our plan, we proposed that, similar to Houston, they implement a network of high-frequency bus service. In Houston, this ended up increasing local bus usage by about 2% and LRT usage by 12%. We also want to institute a congestion pricing zone around the downtown area, similar to what's done in London or Singapore, with the idea that transit provides the highest level of service to the downtown already. Also, we want to expand the cycling network to increase protection for cyclists, so instead of having sharrows and striped bike lanes, you move more to physical barriers or cycle traffic. And so, shown in red here are the routes that we propose to include in the high-frequency bus network, and as you can see, by and large, they serve a lot of areas with high population density. And here you can see the existing cycling network. The gray lines show roadways with sharrows, and the blue lines show roadways with striped bike lanes. What we're proposing to do is institute a network of protected bike lanes, either through physical barriers and or grade separation. And so looking at the impact of these proposed changes, with respect to the most splits, you see about a 4% decrease in the number of trips made by auto, a 3% increase in transit usage, and a 0.04% increase in the number of trips made by active bus. This is relatively conservative because we didn't implement any new infrastructure. We essentially just decreased the headways of some of the bus routes. And at the same time, Denver, given that it's heavily auto-centric now, might take a while to come around the transit. In terms of vehicle miles traveled, based on the existing plan and the projection that we took from the 2040 transportation plan, you can see that with our plan, there's about a decrease in vehicle miles traveled of about 2 billion, and on a per capita basis, this works to about a decrease of 480 vehicle miles traveled per person on an annual basis. And so moving on to land use, the majority of Denver is actually zoned for single-family residential uses. And oddly enough, the employment and mixed-use areas predominantly lie along rapid transit lines. And also just in doing the preparation for this part of the project, the Denver zoning code was very prescriptive. It tells you basically exactly what type of building you can build, what your floor area is, and it's very, very handy. So, like I was talking about before, these turquoise areas show the portions of Denver that were zoned for single-family residential uses. And as you can see, that's the majority of the city. And this creates issues in terms of trying to make changes to make the land uses more sustainable, because in the zoning code currently, they make provisions to protect and actually promote areas of this nature. And as you can see here, a lot of the employment areas and the mixed-use areas lie along rapid transit corridors, including the Denver International Airport, which is shown on the ground up here. So as part of our plan for the proposed changes, we want to essentially decrease minimum parking requirements in the vicinity of transit stops, implement a minimum bike parking requirement. We'd also like to improve the pedestrian environment by ensuring that sidewalks are actually connected amongst one another, and implementing a minimum sidewalk width. And also, in order to kind of diversify the mix of uses, we want to implement minimum green space requirements for developments, which can be in the form of an urban canopy or something as simple as a park. And here's an overview of the neighborhood that we've designed. On the corner of Turrituro Road, as you can see here, there's about a 10-story mixed-use building that has office, retail, and residential space. And along the Arturo roadways, you have retail on the one side and townhouses on the other side. Some of the main features of our design is that the green space is used to facilitate access to transit and cycling facilities, and has the added bonus of having positive psychological impacts for the residents. Also, having the mix of uses in this area helps to provide the proverbial eyes on the street, meaning that it will be used by many different types of people for a greater portion of the day. Also, it's difficult to notice, but these little black squares on the roofs of all these buildings are solar panels, which feed into a common grid.
Now, we're going to move on to energy. We want to do two things. We want to reduce the demand for energy in Denver, and we want to minimize the GHG impact of energy use in Denver. So at the moment, energy demand is expected to remain the same between now and 2050. That's true for the entirety of the United States. We don't think that's good enough. We want that to go down because we want to reduce our impact. So on the demand side, we recommend following through on our green building strategy, which we outlined earlier in the presentation. Move toward a low carbon transportation, getting more electric vehicles or more public transit. Having a carbon tax obviously decreases the energy used from fossil fuels, and for the city to share best practices on conservation with their businesses and citizens. On the supply side, as you can see on the graph, 2/3 of Denver's electricity supply is provided by coal, fire plants, and 3/4 in total is fossil fuels. Renewables makes up only about 1/4 of the entire energy supply. So what we want to suggest is to mimic the energy mix of Southern Ontario, to completely eliminate coal-fired by 2050 and replace them with a similar capacity from nuclear fission, and to use natural gas as a transition fuel. Also, we're expecting that carbon capture technologies will be well developed by 2050, that natural gas may still be part of the mix. We want to encourage renewable microgrids within the cities, within neighborhoods themselves, for example. And we want to discourage hydropower completely because of where Denver is. The hydrology of the region is not going to be favorable toward hydropower. So now we move on to water. So Denver is landlocked. The map on the left shows basically Denver is on the right side of the map over here, and there's a series of canals and reservoirs within the area that supply water for Denver. The one circled in red on the left is big enough to hold about 40% of Denver's annual water supply. So this is basically how it works. They just rely on precipitation and rainfall. They can't reach any of the big water bodies. The graph on the right shows that water demand by 2050 will double, and almost none of their current plans to expand capacity will be able to meet that demand. We want to also note that most of the water demand happens in the residential sector itself. So what are we going to do about this doubling of water demand? Well, this happens to be the most well-developed policy area for Denver, so there's not much that we could add, but what they do have is they have variable pricing to manage drought. They want to experiment with underground aquifers and move away from groundwater. They want to integrate into a regional water supply network. And they currently completed a recycled water plant that recycles some of their wastewater, some of their gray water. But we don't think that's enough. We want them to go further and make sure that their recycling water capacity is enough to meet all of their demand, try to recycle all of the wastewater. We also recommend that they capture rainwater. Right now, Denver experiences about 400 millimeters of rain every year, which isn't that much, and it's expected to go down slightly to about 380 by 2050. But even if they can capture that much in the area of Denver, that can meet about their annual water supply. It's also good for the consumer side to have metered water usage with real-time feedback so that consumers can make their own choices about when to use water and how, and if there are any leaks, for example. In terms of waste, Denver generates about 260,000 tons of waste every year. Even though it accounts for only 1% of GHG emissions, we still want to reduce their impact because it's all going to landfills right now, and it's projected to increase by about 50% annually by 2050. So what we recommend to happen by 2050 is that consumers should be encouraged to reduce their consumption of material. And it's totally possible to do that while maintaining a standard of living, because Japan is apparently able to maintain a good standard of living by using about 40% less material per capita. We want to encourage more biodegradable material in the waste, and also try to divert all of the waste to biomass facilities that will generate power for the city, to try to eliminate landfills as much as possible. So what is all of this going to do for our GHG emissions in 2050? This graph shows, on the left bar shows today's emissions, about 60 megatons in different sectors, like the building sector over here and the transportation sector in gray. We broke down the future into 3 different scenarios. The first scenario is do nothing, like do absolutely nothing to reduce GHG emissions. It's going to go all the way up to 80. The second scenario is do whatever Denver plans on doing right now, which still increases the total to about 70. The third scenario is implement everything that we suggested, and it goes all the way down to 16 megatons in total emissions. On a per capita basis, all scenarios decrease per capita, but our plans would decrease it from 20 to about 4 megatons per capita. How does that compare to their targets? Currently, they have two targets. They have reducing GHG emissions by 10% from 1990 levels and by 80% 2050. So at the top over here are the do nothing scenario and implement current plan scenario, and it does nothing to reach either of the targets. But for our plans, we come very close to meeting the 2050 target. Now we're confident that it can meet the target, even exceed it, because we've made very conservative estimates on GHG reduction. So we're very proud of that. Oh, this is the revised urban metabolism. So we've just rerouted all the waste from landfills to biomass electricity generation and increased the recycled water capacity, reducing per capita impacts on the environment overall. So how does that all relate to goal 11, sustainable development? Well, Denver pretty much being in an advanced economy and a relatively liberal democracy, it meets most of these goals, perhaps all of them to a certain extent, but there are a couple of points of contention. The first one is affordable housing. They do have a slight homelessness problem, and it can get really ugly if, as the economy is expected to grow, housing prices can get out of control, like happened in like San Francisco, Toronto, Vancouver. So that's something that they need to watch. Another point of contention is to tie together the urban success with the rural success, and that's just a big challenge in the U.S., but also in all other developed countries, to try to share economic success between urban and rural areas. That's also something they need to work on from a policy perspective. But overall, they do meet all of the targets from that goal. Any questions?